Our scripture this morning comes from Isaiah and from the Gospel of John. We are reading Isaiah chapter 53. Susan didn't know where to cut it off because it's all good stuff, okay? So it's a little bit long, so you need to listen fast because we've also got communion. Isaiah chapter 53. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took upon our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and a sheep before its shearers is silent. And so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. And from the Gospel of John. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was given before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." May God add his blessing to the reading of this, his holy word.
I'm going to ask for your forgiveness in advance if I become emotional today during our message, because the topic is one that, when I finally grasped its gravity, just threw my world into a whirlwind. And so it's difficult for me to talk about it and express it, sometimes without becoming really emotional about it. So you may find that too. Our title today is "What's So Amazing About Grace?" And I'm sure many of you know the hymn, Amazing Grace. This is going to be an interactive portion, so I hope you're ready to participate. So I'm going to say part of the hymn, and then you're going to finish with the next word or next couple words. Are you ready for this challenge? Ready. Amazing grace, how sweet the... Good. There's one point. That saved a... You know it. I once was... But now I'm was. Keep going. But now I see. Oh, you know it. That's beautiful. Well done. You all earned your A's for today. A little bit of a history lesson. I'm sure in this service especially, probably a number of you already know a little bit of the origin to this hymn. But it's kind of interesting if you don't, that it actually was written in the late 1700s by a man named John Newton, who was actually very prominent in the slave trade. And one night, as they were on the ship coming back, there was a treacherous storm, and he was certain that he was going to lose his life in this storm, but he did in fact survive. And it was from that incident that he was inspired then to write the hymn, Amazing Grace. He didn't actually leave his life as a slave trader right then, but later did in fact renounce it and became prominent in the abolition movement. And I find it really interesting that someone whose profession involved enslaving people, and who probably was very much enslaved himself by the evil that had to have resided there to be able to do that in good conscience, then creates this hymn that is so much about freedom and turned his own life to freedom. And when I think about grace, the word that I find kind of synonymous with it is freedom. My first recognition of grace and its gravity came about 6 years ago. A lot of you have a much longer history with it than I do. But it was in Pastor Craig's office, which is now Pastor Chris's office. And at that point in my life, Alex and I had been attending here for a little while, and we were just kind of dabbling with this idea of baptism, really sitting the fence. Not really sure what it truly meant, and if we were ready to take that step and take that leap. And, I was a mess. I still am a mess. Let's be quite honest about that. But at that time, I was really a mess. And I was attending church regularly, and I was reading my Bible, but I wasn't really studying it yet. And I knew that I was ready to move forward and to progress in my faith, but I really felt like I was going to be a hypocrite. That if I received these waters of baptism, that meant that I was standing before the congregation saying, well, because I have it all so together, I'm ready to be baptized and to live this holy Christian life. And I didn't understand at that time that baptism is just the beginning of the journey. I saw it as the end, but it's just the beginning. And I remember sitting in Pastor Duke's office and just rambling about my insecurities and my questions and my doubts. And my biggest question, what I could not wrap my brain and my heart around, was why? Why would God care so much about me that he would give his son? Why would Jesus submit to his Father and suffer and hang on a cross and endure the taunting and endure being forsaken by his Father for me? This big mess. This person who lives, a couple thousand years later, who sometimes willfully does things I know I shouldn't do. This person who deals with insecurities and this drive for irrational perfection, and this person who has very little self-control, as Pam can attest to with my cookie consumption yesterday. Why would he die for me? How could he have done that for this person who so clearly does not deserve any piece of that? And it sounds like, that's just a really heady question, and yeah, we all have that doubt, but I don't think you understood the depth of that for me. I wanted to accept it so badly, but I just couldn't. It didn't make any sense to me. And I remember sitting there and asking him over and over, why? Why did he do this? Why did this happen? How could this be for me? And bless his heart, he just sat there and smiled and nodded his head and patted my knee. And he said, because he loves you. And that was all he could say. And I wept. I completely broke down and I cried. And I can remember, it was that like shoulder shaking, gut wrenching. My heart is breaking into pieces because I am finally understanding just what this means. Finally understanding just what he's done for me, because this notion of sacrificial love was so foreign to me. That was not my experience. My experience of love had been one of condition and of expectation. And so I desperately needed that love that required nothing of me, but I didn't know how to accept it because I'd never been asked to do that before. And that is grace, and that is amazing. And I have to admit that even now, 6 years later and much further along in my faith journey, thankfully for you as you have to listen to me speak today, much further along in my relationship with God, there are still moments where the gravity of that realization that the cost of my freedom was Christ's crucifixion, that it's by grace I have been saved, not for myself, but it's the gift of God. The gravity of that realization still brings me to tears in quiet moments. Because I don't think about it when I'm busy, and I don't think about it when there's noise, but in those quiet moments in my time with God, when I'm reminded, this is why I get to have a relationship with Him, it moves me. And I still feel so unworthy every day. And what's so amazing about grace is that in that moment, in that realization, I was free from trying to earn anybody's love. And that was a struggle that I had lived with my entire life. And grace is transformative. A number of years ago, we took our girls to see a movie. It was a great classic movie. You may know it was called Romeo and Juliet. I don't know if you see Romeo and Juliet. You know, I was teaching English at the time. The whole connections with Romeo and Juliet were more than what I could pass by. But it was their first 3D movie. And we think Caitlin was probably 6. And so Kendall was probably just really too little to fully appreciate going to a movie. But we wanted to go see this movie, first 3D experience. We were so excited to put on our ultra cool 3D glasses and, you know, have the effects pop out at us and be wowed by the characters leaping off the screen. And I imagine these big reactions from my girls as they got to experience this for the first time. And I noticed about halfway through the film that Caitlin, she was sitting there on this little booster seat, and she would laugh at the funny parts, but she wasn't reacting. You know, usually when things come flying at you, it's kind of this freaky thing. And she was just sitting there watching the movie, and I leaned over and I asked her what she thought about the film, and wasn't it cool, you know, how all this stuff was just flying out at you, and like you could just reach out and touch them. And she looked over at me, and her little glasses were perched right here on her nose. And she said, "No, Mommy, it all just looks fuzzy to me." And this poor girl had sat through half the movie with her 3D glasses right down here because they were too big for her little tiny face. So we pushed her glasses up, and she held them for the rest of the movie. But she missed so much of the brilliance of this film because she didn't have the lenses up. She wasn't seeing through those correct lenses. And I wonder how often we miss evidence of God's grace, of those daily blessings, because we aren't looking at our circumstances. We're not looking at our families and our loved ones and our jobs and our homes and our world through the lenses of grace. And a new layer in my understanding of grace developed when I understood that it's not a one-time event. It's not just that one time when you accept Christ into your heart and you are saved. It's not just a matter of salvation. Yes, it is the way to eternal life, but it's also how we're able to live a Christian life on this earth. We need God's grace daily because the Christian walk is not an easy walk. It's countercultural. And it feels so contrary to our human nature to fully live out grace the way that Jesus expects us to. We live in a culture that values fairness, and it values justice, and it values hard work and earning your rewards and earning your promotions and to wealth and to status. That's the world that we live in. But that's not the model nor the message that Jesus Christ gave us. And you might say, well, that was a different time. No, Grace was pretty countercultural then, too. And so in Jesus, we see a man who didn't condemn the woman at the well for having numerous husbands, didn't punish her, didn't demean her, but simply said, I know where you've been. I have something better I can offer you. Now go and be a missionary for me. And she did. Jesus didn't condemn the adulteress who was dragged out into the streets by the Pharisees, ashamed, embarrassed, terrified that she was about to lose her life at the hands of these men who knew the law better than anybody, but knew nothing of grace. Instead, he shamed the Pharisees, and he forgave her and sent her to live a life free from sin. And he didn't condemn Peter for denying him, not once, not twice, not 3 times. But he said, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Tend my sheep. Go make disciples. Do the work in my name. And every single one of them deserved punishment. Every single one of them deserved whatever judgment there was for them to receive. But Jesus doesn't see the sin. He sees the heart, and he sees that piece of us that is made in God's image. He sees God's likeness in us when we often don't see it in ourselves. For me, that's where those feelings of unworthiness come from, I think. Because my head knows I'm made in the image of God, but man, my heart, sometimes my heart still has a really hard time accepting that. If we're followers of Christ, we have to do the same. We have to follow the model that he set for us. And we can only do that through the lens of grace. And just how we do that, I think, is the topic for another time that requires a lot more than what I can give you today. But what I can tell you is that there is freedom again in that choice. Not the freedom of salvation, but the freedom from the power that our condemnation of other people has in our lives. When we see people through the lens of grace, it frees us from the hatred and the judgment and the bitterness that can be such a natural part of our human nature. Choosing to see through the lens of grace frees us from that. And the truth is, when we look at our world and when we look at what other people are doing and how other people are living, and we see atrocities and we see people making very poor choices, and we have that temptation to judge, if we don't accept that God loves and saves others just as much as he loves and saves us, even those who've done atrocious things that we cannot begin to understand, then there's no truth to the gospel. There is no gospel. And we have to come to terms with that. If you follow me on social media, on Facebook or on Instagram, you would have seen a picture last week. We were camping at Abandoned Woods, and I had taken my materials with me, and in a quiet moment when, I don't know where everybody else was, but I was sitting outside the camper and had my paper in front of me, had my Bible, had a book I was reading, and I was all set to work on this message. And I'd sat there for probably 20 minutes with a blank page in front of me, just praying and reading and kind of waiting. And there was a butterfly that just kind of flittered around, and it landed on the page. And I'd go to grab my phone and try to take a picture, and it'd flitter around some more, and it'd be gone for a while, and it'd come back, and it sat on the page. And I mean, this went on for a while, this flittering, sitting, phone, flittering, sitting, phone. And finally, it sat still long enough, and it opened up its wings. And I got it. I got that shot. And I knew that in that moment, I try not to read too much into things, but I know clearly when God is speaking to me. And I knew that that was a message in some way. I didn't understand what that message was, but I knew in some way that butterfly on that page, there was something there for me that he was saying to me. And I took that shot. And do you know that then 3 days later, sitting on my deck, had all my materials out, working on my message, and here comes a butterfly. And I landed on my shoe this time. And I'm like, all right, just say it loud and clear. And it wasn't until yesterday that I really figured it out. And in this whole idea of freedom, I thought, well, what do butterflies have to do with this? For Pete's sake, just tell me. And I thought about the process that a butterfly goes through to become what it is. That it begins as a caterpillar, nothing special, probably typically kind of ugly. And then they go through that process of wrapping in layers, of wrapping in protection, and just kind of hiding out and growing and developing. And then it's as they emerge that they are that beautiful butterfly. And I think about my journey through this understanding of grace, and I wonder if that butterfly, does it feel bound? Does it feel constricted as it's growing? Does it feel like it's being oppressed until it finally is able to break free and spread its wings and share its beauty? And I feel that way too. Because in grace there is freedom. There is freedom from death. There is freedom from judgment. There is freedom from pain. And instead we find joy and we find purpose. And that is beautiful. And that is amazing. And that, I think, is what's so amazing about grace. Another story from our camping trip. It's going to lead right into communion. It's going to be a great transition, so I hope you're ready. All right. I like to feed people. And when we camp with some of our friends, we typically will kind of divide up who's going to feed, each night. Like somebody does breakfast and somebody does the evening meal. And there was a third couple there with us this time that we had invited over to eat. And 2 or 3 times she asked me, well, what can I bring? What can I bring? I didn't want her to bring anything. I've got it. I just want you to come. Just come and be part of this meal and hang out with us and let's have a good time and let me feed you, let me nourish you. What can I bring? She was determined that she had to bring something. Have you had that experience when you've entertained people? Isn't that always the question? What can I bring? We don't have to bring anything to God except ourselves. And that's the other amazing thing about grace. It's not given to us because we've brought a single thing to the table, because we have a single thing to offer, because the reality is that we don't. And so we come to the table with just ourselves, with just our hearts. And I don't miss the fact or the significance that we have communion today, where we come to the Lord's table with just ourselves, just our broken hearts that we can offer to Him. And He can pour His grace on us.